Christine Casey is the Academic Program Management Officer. I'm sure she'll tell us what that all involves. I'm sure it's a lot with the UC.Davis Bee Haven. And if you haven't visited the Bee Haven, it's over by the UC.Davis airport. Absolutely take an opportunity to do so. It is a wonderful facility to just kind of walk around, learn something, hang out. It's really pretty. It's a nice part of campus that most people don't visit. So take an opportunity to do that. Anyhow, Christine is going to tell us about, I think, probably primarily bees and bee gardening, but I'm sure all kinds of pollinators are going to be sort of in there somewhere. Whatever we do for bees, we can do for other pollinators too. And even if that's not a focus of your gardening, it's certainly important. And we're going to learn how to do it in a reasonable way. So, all right, Christine, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity. Let me go ahead and do this. Okay, let's get out of that and go back to the beginning. Okay. Sorry, I did the same talk this morning for Napa. So, I have a number of handouts that you should have gotten to accompany this. So hopefully that's kind of more background information that should help you if you want to delve into this topic in a little bit more detail. Especially, I sent out a copy of a journal article that is a review of several studies. And are you seeing my presenter view?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And everybody did get the handouts a couple of weeks ago. So hopefully I had a chance to look at them.
Okay, did that work? Are you seeing the presentation now?
Yes.
Okay. I have two monitors, so sometimes I'm not sure which one you're seeing. What I'm going to do today is go through the basics of bees and gardens. Some of this may be parts of this may be review for some of you, but I think it's important to kind of cover the basics so that we're all on the same page as far as our knowledge of bees and insects more generally and gardens. So bees, of course, are insects.
I think we're seeing the presenter view now.
Okay.
I think the first, there you
How's
go.
that?
That's better.
All right. So like all insects, bees have three body segments: of a head, thorax, and an abdomen. What distinguishes bees from other insects is that they have specialized structures for pollen transport. And this is because bees are vegans. They get all of their food material from plants, either pollen or nectar. And so they've evolved specialized structures for transporting those materials to make that process more efficient. Bees are very diverse. And especially here in California, we have about 40% of all North American bee species occur in our state. And I think that's a direct reflection of the geographic and diversity, which of course drives plant diversity in the state, and gives us a real opportunity to have our gardens serve as points of bee conservation. So I think that's what's so important about gardening for bees, is that it isn't just something that's kind of fun to do and we get to watch some interesting animals. Our gardens really can be important sources of habitat, a habitat that's being lost to development and other and for other reasons. So that's why I really encourage folks to garden for bees or for insects or wildlife more generally. When most people think of a bee, they think of a honeybee. And honeybees, unfortunately, for our understanding of the bee world, are actually kind of unusual in the way that they live compared to most bees. Honeybees are social bees. which means that they have division of labor within the hive and some kind of care of the young. And most bees, however, don't have this. They're not social, they're solitary. And this means that the male and the female mate, there's no queen, there's just a male and a female. They mate, she lays eggs, and that's it. And one of the important reasons that this is so important as a distinction is that queens can be replaced. If the queen bee dies in a honeybee hive, they can make a new queen and continue the process of laying eggs and reproducing. That's not the case with the solitary bees. And most of our native bees nest underground, about 70% of them do, with the remaining 30% what we call cavity nesting. They nest above ground in a variety of cavities that occur in wood or in nests that we put in the garden for them. And we'll talk about that in more detail about how to provide for each of those. But just to give you an idea of the diversity of bees, we have 300 species that are known to occur in Yolo County, and 85 species have been seen at the bee haven. And the photograph on the top there shows you the smallest and the largest bee that we've seen at the garden. So as I mentioned, honeybees are social insects. There's a division of labor. The queen doesn't forage. She goes out once for a mating flight. And in that mating flight, she acquires and can store all the sperm that she will need for her lifetime. The other distinction with social bees compared to solitary bees is that pollen and nectar are processed before they're fed to the young bees. And this means that there's a certain amount of removal of toxins from those materials. So our social bees are buffered a little bit from some of the environmental toxins that can be harmful to bees. And this is not the case with solitary bees. There's no processing of the pollen or the nectar. And both these reasons, the fact that the queen can be replaced and the lack of processing of those food materials, really points to our solitary bees as being at risk from a habitat loss, environmental issues, that kind of thing. And with the solitary bees, the females are the ones that are building the nests, laying the eggs, provisioning the food for the young. And so you'll often see clusters of the male bees gathered on plant stems at night because they have nowhere to go. When the females go into the nest at night, the males cluster on plant stems, waiting for the next day for females to come out so that they can look for them for mating. And the nests that the bees make, especially underground, are very subtle. The photograph on the lower right with the two red circles shows where nests have been excavated in the ground by solitary bees. And you see just a little bit of soil piled up, but something that could very easily be missed. The other thing to think about in terms of bee biology and how this relates to our gardens is the way that bees carry their pollen. Most bees carry pollen externally on their legs. Some carry it on the underside of the abdomen, and a very few species carry their pollen internally. But there's two main ways that it can be carried externally. Bees that carry pollen dry do it in a structure called a scopa, which is simply a series of long hairs that they can pack the pollen into. And you can see two examples of this on the left, the longhorn bee on the bottom, and then the leafcutter bee on the top. You'll notice she's carrying pollen on her abdomen. And the leafcutter bees do this because they're the ones that are going into those cavities to lay their eggs. And obviously, if they were carrying it on their legs, it would get knocked off as they went in and out to build their nests. Corbiculate bees, as the name says, carry bees in a structure called a corbicula, which you can see is that sort of dish-shaped adaptation on the rear legs in the right-hand photograph. And the difference with these bees is that the pollen is carried moist. They mix pollen with nectar before they pack it into that structure, which speaks to the importance of making sure that there are plants that are providing both pollen and nectar together at the same time in the garden. Some other distinctions between bees are the difference in appearance and structure of male and female bees. Only female bees are collecting pollen because it's the females who are building the nests, laying the eggs. And so only females have structures for pollen transport. And a good example of this in the leafcutter bees is seen on the left, where the male bee is on the top and the female's on the bottom. And you'll notice two things. First of all, the male's abdomen is much smaller. It doesn't need to contain eggs, and it doesn't have those hairs on the bottom for carrying pollen. And the other thing that you'll notice is the female on the bottom who is carrying pollen, she's raising her abdomen up off the flower. And this is a characteristic pose that you'll see in leafcutter bees because they have to keep that abdomen raised to pack pollen into it. So even if she's not carrying pollen, if you see a bee doing this, it gives you an idea of what type of bee it is. In the center, we have a male and a female longhorn bee. And if you take a look at the hind leg of the male in the top photo, you can see it looks rather slender. And that's because it doesn't have any of those hairs that the female has for collecting pollen. And you can see that difference in the female in the lower photograph. And then sometimes the physical appearance of males and females is quite different. And probably the most extreme example of this is the valley carpenter bee, where the male is bright yellow, as you can see on the top, and the female solid black. Some other things that bees do or utilize in order to make foraging more efficient revolve around plant structure and their understanding or their ability to use plants in interesting ways. And so one thing that is really helpful for bees and really makes a flower useful for bees is that it's of a structure where it has landing pads. So the fused petals, for example, in a salvia flower, make a great point of attachment so that the bee, as you can see on the left, can hold on while she inserts her tongue down into the base of that salvia flower to collect nectar. Carpenter bees have a unique adaptation. Their mouth parts are different from all other kinds of bees in that they can actually cut plant tissue, or their mouth parts are almost like little saws. And so the carpenter bees are capable of doing something called nectar robbing, which you see in that upper photograph in the center. And she's actually cut a slit in the base of that flower, and it has inserted her tongue to collect nectar that way because she's too big to fit into the flower and access the nectar resource the way that the flower essentially intended. And we call this robbing because the reason that flowers provide pollen and nectar rewards for bees is that they perform a pollination service in the process of obtaining those. And by getting pollen this way, they're circumventing that process and are robbing the resource. Bees have also learned how to manipulate their bodies to effectively gather resources from flowers. For example, penstemon, the bumblebee in the lower photograph, the bumblebees have learned to rotate their bodies when they enter that flower because it puts them in an advantageous location to collect pollen. And then in the upper right, you can see a honeybee pushing open the petals on an unopened bog sage flower to be able to get inside the flower and access the resources. And finally, talking about pollination, I think it's really important to understand this interesting sort of pollination called buzz pollination. And buzz pollination is not something that all bees can do. For example, honeybees can't buzz pollinate. And what happens is that buzz pollinators are able to uncouple their flight muscles from their body. And when they land on a flower, they can vibrate their body muscles, vibrate the muscles in the thorax without flight. And this causes their bodies to vibrate. And flowers in some families, like probably the most common example is the solanaceous plants, have anthers in which anthers that are fused together. And the anthers only have a small slit in them through which the pollen can exit. And buzz pollinators can land on those flowers, vibrate the flower so that the pollen falls onto their body, and then they then move on to the next flower. And for many years, we assumed that honeybees, or we assumed rather that tomatoes were wind pollinated because honeybees couldn't pollinate them. And the more we learned about bees and buzz pollination, we began to appreciate the importance of other bees in tomato pollination. And in fact, several years ago, some researchers from Berkeley came out to the tomato fields in Yolo County and found that if they planted flower borders around the tomato fields, there was a higher yield because they were bringing in some of those buzz pollinators that otherwise wouldn't have been there. So let's go on now. I want to talk about some of the most common groups of bees that you'll see in gardens, just so that you have an idea of what they look like, what to look for, and just a little bit more about their biology. The largest family of bees is the Apidae, and so most of these bees are in that family. And I'm going to start with honeybees because they're the bee that I think serves as a good reference point for other bees, because that's what people know, and also because generally they are the most prevalent bee in our gardens because folks are keeping them and keeping them as managed colonies. Honeybees are not native to North America. They're native to Eurasia and come from a pretty wide swath going up into Russia and down to the southern Mediterranean. And so there are various subspecies of honeybees from these different regions. And while most honeybees have this typical appearance that we see here, there are some of those subspecies that are solid brown and others that are almost completely yellow. So if you think it's a honeybee but doesn't have quite this typical striped coloration, chances are it's one of those other varieties. Honeybees, of course, are kept mostly in managed hives by beekeepers, although there are feral bees as well that have escaped from hives and are living in tree cavities, and hopefully not in anyone's wall or roof cavity, but that is not unusual, unfortunately. In the same family, probably the next most common would be the carpenter bees. And these are not bumblebees. I often get people telling me they see this large black bumblebee in their garden. That's a carpenter bee. There's no solid black bumblebees in California. And as we mentioned before, they have a very distinctive difference in appearance between males and females in the valley carpenter bee. You can see those two in the upper two photographs. The other common carpenter bee in our gardens is the mountain carpenter bee. And she's about 3/4 the size of the valley carpenter bee. And that's the mountain carpenter bee female on the left, also solid black. And these bees, as the name indicates, are native mostly to the foothills of the Sierras, but they tend to prefer to nest in redwood. And as we've used more and more redwood materials in our gardens down in the Central Valley, they've moved down into this area. They don't nest in solid wood. They nest in wood that is starting to decay. So you'll see them in trees that are starting to decline, or in fences that maybe are near the end of their useful life. The males of each of the species are shown in those bottom two photographs on the right. Again, you can see the male of the mountain carpenter, of the valley carpenter bee rather, coming out of a nest. And I mentioned before that the males generally don't go into the nests. This would be one exception. And then the photograph in the bottom center is the male of the mountain carpenter bee. You can see he has one yellow band on his thorax and a yellow face. And he's often confused with the yellow-faced bumblebee. But an easy way to tell them apart is that the yellow on the bumblebee is actually hairs, whereas on this bee, there are no hairs. You see the yellow is actually in the integument or the skin itself. And then, of course, moving on to bumblebees, and an example of this, you can see that yellow-faced bumblebee is the one in the photograph on the lower right. And you can clearly see the yellow in the face comes from the hair and not just the coloring of the skin. Bumblebees are not as common in gardens as the other two that I've just mentioned, especially for us here in Yolo County. Bumblebees have a preference for areas that are near water. We see them pretty regularly at the Haven because of our proximity to Puda Creek. And of course, if you live somewhere not too far from that, then you probably have them in your garden. They're very common along the American River Parkway in Sacramento, again, because of that proximity to water. And bumblebees are social bees. So they do have a queen, and they nest underground. And bumblebees also do make honey, but they only make enough honey to provide food for the queen over the winter. Their life cycle is such that A female will mate in the fall, and that's when she becomes the queen because she's a mated female. And then she spends the winter underground in the nest by herself, just feeding on that honey. And then she fertilizes her eggs in the spring and comes out in the spring to look for pollen, especially because she needs the protein in the pollen for those eggs to develop. And then once they do and the workers hatch, they do the foraging and can support the hive for the rest of the season. Still in the family Apidae are the longhorn bees. And as the name indicates, they have very distinctive long antennae. In some cases, the antennae are even longer than the body of the bee itself. So they're very distinctive and pretty easy to spot in the garden. They look somewhat superficially like honeybees, but the long antennae really give them away. And these are solitary bees, so you will see those clusters of males on plant stems at dusk and dawn, as you see in the photograph on the lower right. They're active mostly in summer and even into fall. There is one genus, Eucera, which is active in the spring, and that's the bee in the lower photograph in the center, but they're much less common than their relatives that are active in the summer. And they do tend to have a preference for plants in the Asteraceae, so things that are related to sunflowers, although they do forage on other things, that's likely where you'll see them first. Sweat bees are a very large, diverse group of bees. And even though they're a large group of bees, they're among the smallest bees that occur in our gardens. To give you an idea of scale, if you look at the center photograph on the bottom, the echinacea flowers, if you look at the flower second from the right, you see a small yellow dot. That's the pollen on the legs of a sweat bee. Another indication of scale is the yarrow flower directly to the right of that. So these are very small bees. They can be quite colorful, as you see in the center photograph on top. And they are, as I said, a very large and diverse group. Some of them nest underground, some of them nest above ground. But the photograph on the left shows those holes that are their nest entrances in the ground. And then finally, another common group of bees that we see in our gardens are the leafcutter bees. And even if you've never seen the bee, I'm sure you've seen those leaf pieces that have been removed from plants. In this area, they seem to have a preference for both roses and our native redbuds. And despite the common name of leafcutter bee, not all species use leaf pieces. Some of them use flower pieces, like you see in the upper photograph. Some of them use bits of decomposed granite. Some of them scrape plant hairs, which give the filled nesting cavity the appearance that it's been stuffed with cotton balls. And you can see that in the center photograph on the right in the middle of those nesting tubes. And these bees, as are in that group we call cavity nesting bees. And they have to use an existing cavity in order to build their nests. They don't excavate their own. And that's distinctive from the carpenter bees, which are also nesting above ground, but can, because of those distinctive mouth parts, actually excavate their own nests into wood. These bees have to find pre-existing cavities, cracks and crevices underneath tree bark, galleries that beetles have excavated. They're very opportunistic in urban settings. They'll nest under roof shingles, or they'll use many of those bee houses that we see for sale in garden centers. The way these bees operate is the female goes out and collects pollen and nectar. She goes into whatever cavity she's going to be laying her eggs in, makes a ball of those resources, lays an egg on top of it, and then goes back and collects leaf pieces, bits of mud, whatever the material is that she uses to encase her egg. She collects those, brings them back. And just to give you an idea, that photograph in the center there is a cross section of one of these galleries that's filled with eggs that are covered with leaf pieces. And I dissected this and found an average of 15 leaf pieces per egg mass. So they do quite a bit of work in order to protect those eggs. The bees that do this that are native in California only have one generation a year. So they spend the eggs get laid in the spring and early summer. The adults die, and then those eggs hatch and emerge the following year. So I mentioned before that bees are vegans. They use pollen as their protein source and nectar as their carbohydrate source. And some things to understand about these food components are that they're actually quite variable depending on the plant they come from. Just like we need to eat a varied diet in order to get all of the complete amino acids that we need, the same is true for bees. They need to have a mix of pollen from a variety of plants in order to have complete nutrition. The exception would be the relatively small number of bees that specialize on a certain plant. Most bees are general feeders and do need to have that mix of plants in order to get that complete nutrition. And the same is true with the nectar. We've typically in the past have just thought of nectar as an energy source, but the more that bees have been studied, we've really begun to appreciate that nectar contains not only the sugars that we associate them with, but they also contain amino acids and other phytochemicals or secondary plant compounds that have an important impact on bee health. And this is a really emerging area of research that I think is going to give us a lot of good direction for improving bee health in the future. And two common examples of these plant chemicals that impact bee health in a positive way are nicotine and caffeine, which seems kind of amazing when we think of these as being harmful substances for us. But there have been numerous studies documenting that when bees have exposure to these materials in their nectar, their health is actually improved. And while I'm not suggesting that we all go out and start planting tobacco, I think what we can take away from this is that this will allow us to develop supplements, especially for honeybees, to increase the health of the hive, to supplement the food that they're bringing back, because in many cases, the health of bees is limited by the lack of adequate forage. And again, that comes back to the point of why our gardens are so important. In terms of planting gardens, there's some things to understand about how bees see their environment and how they select plants that I think we can put into practice in terms of designing our gardens. Bees see in the ultraviolet spectrum, so they see the colors purple, yellow, and white most visibly. So that's why a lot of bee gardens, and no exception, many of our flowers are purple because these are flowers that bees see well and have a preference for. Color is used both as a long-range cue. For example, bees moving in air currents above a garden might see those blocks of color and drop down to investigate. Contrast is also important. So having plants with different color flowers next to each other can help bees to pick out flowers out of a very complex environment. And then saturation in terms of the hue of the color is important as well. And kind of building on that, bees distinguish quickly between different colors, but more slowly between similar colors. So again, this suggests that planting in blocks of different colors might help to make a garden more visible to bees. And then, of course, scent is used both for long-range plant finding as well as close-up food location. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about some of the research projects I've been involved with to look at plant preference among different species. But one thing that I will point out is that some of my colleagues who did this work in other parts of the country looked specifically at bedding plants and found that the typical things like impatiens, begonias, geraniums that we plant as bedding plants in our gardens essentially were useless in terms of bee forage. So just something to keep in mind as far as plant selection goes. Some other things that it's important to know about bees in terms of designing gardens, or to understand better how they find flowers, is that contrast is important. When you think about the world around us and imagine you're a bee, and out of all the people and roads and cars and buildings, you have to find not only a flower, but the very center of a flower where the pollen and nectar are located. And you have to do this hundreds of times a day. Bees have evolved very sophisticated mechanisms in order to make this process efficient. And one example of this is that the color green seems to appear dark to bees. So you have a very strong contrast between the foliage and the flowers, which is going to help them hone in on just the part of the flower that they need. In addition, bee attracting flowers tend to have ultraviolet absorbing centers and edges that reflect UV. And the photograph on the upper right here, or upper left, is a great example of this. This is a flannel bush flower that is being lit by an ultraviolet light. And you can see the nectar in the center of the flower is fluorescing bright blue. And that's exactly what the bee sees. So it gives a very clear indication of where the resource is. Similarly, on the right, those dots in the center of the lupin flower are nectar guides. And if you look carefully at a lot of flowers, especially things in the mint family, look carefully the next time you see a catmint flower, and you'll see those small dots leading towards the center of the flower where the bee resources are located. Some other interesting observations are that edge structures may help bees to find plants. And specifically, a study was done in Great Britain that showed that bumblebees prefer to nest on linear gradients like fences and garden edges. And indeed, I see this in my own garden, where all of the ground nesting bees make their nests right along the edge of the pathway, where those just next to that stone border. And I've got that highlighted in the red circles there. So that edge structure really seems to be something that they're going to utilize. So in terms of leaving some bare soil in your garden for those ground nesting bees, if you can do it along a gradient like a fence or the side of a building like a garage, that may be helpful. And then again, because that foraging process has to be so efficient, bees have evolved a marking system. And so bumblebees will avoid plants that other bumblebees have recently foraged on. And what they do is they leave a scent behind to mark the flower. And that way an approaching bee can detect that scent and know that it's just been foraged and will not have pollen or nectar in it. And if you take a look at the photograph on the right, you'll notice that the bumblebee approaching that lupin has her antennae straight forward. And she's using her antennae to look for floral cues as well as those chemical markings to tell her whether or not this is a flower she should enter. And if you are ever out in a garden observing bees, take a look and you'll often notice that a bee will come very close to a flower and then at the last minute pull away. And they're detecting that that flower does not have the resources that they need, and they need to move on to the next flower in order to not waste their time. So now that we understand a little bit more about some things about bee biology and how they perceive their world and some of the things we could do in our gardens to accommodate that, let's look more broadly at some of the characteristics that bees need in gardens in order for those gardens to be healthy for bees. Like all animals, bees need food, water, and shelter. And we'll take a look at each of these in more detail. As I mentioned before, most of the bees that we're going to see in our gardens are generalists. They feed on a lot of different kinds of plants. And so it's important to have a mix of plant families because a mix of plant families can provide that difference in plant nutrition that I mentioned before that is so important. Continuous bloom in this part of California, bees are going to be active year-round. As long as it's about 55 degrees and sunny, there's going to be some bee activity. So we want to have things that bloom year-round. Different flower shapes and sizes, especially to accommodate the different sizes of bees that occur in our gardens, are going to be important. And finally, plant in drifts or clumps of the same species put together. This is useful not only for that long-range host finding, because it will concentrate a color or floral volatiles, but also many bees, when they go out to forage, only forage on one species on each foraging trip. So if the plants are all together, that process is more efficient. Some types of plants to think about, including in the garden, include annuals. I mentioned a moment ago that a lot of the typical bedding annuals are not very valuable for bees, but our native wildflowers are great options for providing bee forage. And many of these, of course, will be blooming in late winter and early spring. when bees are out collecting pollen to develop their populations for the summer. And then conversely, in midsummer to going into fall, as we get gaps in the garden, zinnias and cosmos, as well as sunflowers, are all seeds that could be sowed to fill in those gaps that bees will utilize. Winter blooming plants are important. And all of the plant lists, I know I provided you with a plant list today, and we've got others on the Bee Haven website. We always list those plants by season of bloom because it is important to have those things going year round. Shape is also important. If you think back to that first slide that I showed with the tiny little sweat bee and the large 1-inch long carpenter bee, they're going to need very different flower shapes. So small, flat, open flowers like daisies, Santa Barbara daisy is a great one for bees, are going to be really valuable for those small bees, whereas the larger bees need a bigger flower that has that landing pad that they can grasp onto while they forage. And most importantly, I think, is to have a diversity of long blooming perennials in the garden. Certainly we have trees and shrubs that we recommend for bees, but I think the backbone of a bee garden is to have repeat blooming perennials that we can deadhead and continue to get flowers from throughout the growing season. Water is something that I think, we think of birds and their need for water, but insects, we don't think about that so much, and the need to provide water for them in the garden. And indeed, most insects derive all the water that they need from the food they eat. Think of a caterpillar eating a leaf, for example, it's mostly water. But because bees are using pollen and nectar as their food, those are very dry materials. They need to have a separate water source. And some ways that we can do this in the garden are through the use of a soaker hose that will put out small drops of water that bees can drink, or something like a shallow pot bottom that may be something 1 inch in depth that we have water sitting in. And it's important when we're providing for bees, as you see in the photo on the right, we want to keep it dirty. Let leaf material and other organic debris accumulate in there because the nutrients, the minerals that leach out of that organic material are important for bee health. And you can see on the photograph on the right, the 2 bees that are drinking are actually drinking water from the algae that's accumulated on that cork. And then finally, of course, is shelter. Those ground nesting bees that do make up about 70% of our bees that occur in California, they need access to bare soil. They can't go through turf or mulch or anything like that. So we need to have some bare soil in the garden. The cavity nesting bees, in addition, of course, to the bee houses that we can purchase, things like stumps or logs will be real valuable for carpenter bees. They can excavate their own nests in those. And all bees having some kind of masonry shelter in the garden is useful, like a dry stack wall or a dry stream bed. They'll use this early in the year when it's cool out. The masonry will absorb heat and they can sit on that to warm up. And then conversely, in the summer, they can get into the shade in there and get out of the hottest part of the day. And it doesn't, of course, have to be an entire wall. You can just stack a small group of pavers and accomplish the same effect. So just to summarize some of the garden features that have been found to affect both abundance of bees, the number of different bee species, which is richness, and the overall. A study done in Central California found, not surprisingly, that floral abundance was positively correlated with bee diversity and health, whereas the presence of mulch and lack of mulch was, negatively associated, and then of course bare ground was positive. And one interesting study actually looked at the occurrence of these different garden features and the occurrence of disease in the yellow-faced bumblebee, Bombus vosnesenskii, and they found that the more bee species diversity, the more different bee species occurred in a garden, the less disease there was in the bumblebees. And this is probably not so much due to some effect of bees keeping other bees healthy, but the fact that a large diversity of species means that it's a healthy garden overall. And then they also found that high mulch use increased the incidence of disease, as did impervious cover. And then the information on the right there is a summary of the journal article that I provided you in your handouts. And that article is a summary of many different studies that have looked at garden factors and how they affect bee health that I thought would be interesting for those of you who wanted to dive into this in a little bit more detail. And I think the good news, especially for you who are educating other gardeners, is that there's a lot of interest out there among gardeners in gardening for pollinators. And in fact, a study done in Great Britain in the London suburbs found that 70% or over 70% of the customers included pollinator plants in their garden, and many of them were more likely to buy plants labeled as being for pollinators. And specifically, I think from our view as educators, gardeners in the Pacific Northwest were found to be more likely to select a plant after they learned something about the bees that would use it. So I think this presents some great educational opportunities for us to increase the use of these pollinator plants in gardens. And of course, when we're dealing with the public and advising them about plants for bees, a question that I get all the time is, well, aren't all flowers the same? I mean, if a plant has flowers, isn't it going to be good for bees? And I think as we've learned so far, that's definitely not the case. And of some concern is that of the many different bee plant lists out there, the scientific basis of the list, why those plants are being recommended, is not always clear. So I think the best thing that we can advise people to do is go to a trusted source and look at the plants they're recommending. And for us here in California, both Northern California, the Berkeley Urban Bee Lab and the UC.Davis Bee Haven are great places to get that information. In Southern California, my colleagues on the project that I just completed a few years ago, looking at plant preference among bees, have put together a great website that has information about Southern California plants. And so these are all research-based recommendations that come out of many years of observing bees in gardens, and I think are great resources to recommend to folks. Either the website like they have in San Diego, the websites that we have at Davis and Berkeley, or handouts like this one about bees per garden, documenting bees that are plants that are attractive to bees but use very little water. Another question that often comes up is, don't native bees need native plants? And while many insects do better when they have access to native plant material, we don't necessarily find that to be the case for bees, especially in habitats like gardens and farms where there's already been some disturbance. And indeed, there are several studies that have documented that native bees do better when they have access to more non-native plants. Largely, we think because those non-native plants are extending the bloom time or providing pollen and nectar resources at a time when native plants wouldn't be flowering. So if you don't have the ability to have lots of native plants in a garden, you can still have a very healthy garden for bees. But one thing that is important is the idea of species versus cultivars. And echinacea is a great example of this. Not only in that highly doubled cultivar on the right would be impossible for a bee to access pollen and nectar, the plant tissue that gives rise to anthers, which bear pollen, is the same plant tissue that in these varieties produces all the flower petals. So all those petals are being produced at the expense of an important bee resource. So we really want to stick with simple flowers in the bee garden. And then finally, I just want to finish up with a question that, again, we get a lot at the Haven, and I think as educators who are working with the public, this is something you need to be aware of too. We often have concerns expressed from garden visitors that they're afraid to buy plants at a garden center because they think that they're going to have pesticides on them that will be harmful for bees. And it's really important to recognize that the nursery industry is a real essential partner with gardeners in promoting bee health. We need their flowers for our bee gardens. And indeed, many of the big box stores are requiring growers to phase out the use of neonicotinoid pesticides in the production of their plants. And the nursery industry is supporting research to answer questions related to this. Are there pesticides that they can be used safely in their growing practices that will not harm bees? How do pesticides move in plants? can growers have a way to identify bee attractive plants and target those with different pest management practices? And some of that work was funded through the project I mentioned, where we looked at plant preference among bees. Another component of that study was to look at the movement of systemic insecticides, specifically neonicotinoids, in plant parts, including nectar and pollen. And some interesting things came out of that I think begin to give us some reassurance about the use of pesticides in plant production, and also some guidelines for growers in order to allow them to produce plants that are going to be safe and healthy for bees. And so while systemic insecticides like the neonicotinoids do move in all plant parts, they reach different parts in quite different concentrations. And the nectar has much less pesticide residue than leaves or petals. And the way that the pesticide is applied was found to matter as well. Foliar applications were provided residues that were much lower than drench. So that gives us some guidelines about how to apply materials. And I think of most interest for us is that the residues of all of the materials drop below the EPA's level of concern for honeybees by 6 weeks after application. And these graphs show some of those results. On both of these graphs, the pesticide residue concentration in parts per billion is shown on the left. So these are very, very small quantities of material. Weeks after treatment is shown on the bottom line of the graph. And then the chemical name of the different materials is shown over on the right. Drench is on the left graph and the foliar application on the right. And you can see, especially with the foliar applications, by 4 weeks after treatment, all of the materials had dropped below the EPA level of concern for honeybees. An important caveat from this study is that this work was done with herbaceous plants. And some work has been done with woody plants, and we find that pesticides do, at least the neonicotinoids, do remain in detectable levels in plant parts in woody plants for much longer than they do in herbaceous plants. So there's clearly a lot more work that needs to be done in this area. But I think one of my big concerns is not so much the growers, because growers are trained in the use of pesticides. It's the active ingredients that are available to consumers. And this is a list I put together by visiting the garden center in Walmart and Home Depot in Woodland. And you can see all the different active ingredients that I found readily for sale on the shelf to anyone who had great knowledge or no knowledge of pesticide safety. And you can see how many of them are not safe to use with pollinators. And so this is something that gives me a lot more pause than the growers who are going to be using pesticides. And so what I've done for you folks, because I know you are working with consumers and advising them about pest management issues, the materials that I've got listed on the upper left are going to be safe for bees once they've dried, whereas some of those materials are going to be lethal, even though they're safe for bees, are going to be lethal to butterfly larvae. And just a couple of cautions to keep in mind is that you never should apply any pesticide to flowering plants, because the chance that you're going to contact bees is high. If you apply materials at the end of the day, just as it's starting to get dark out, the material will be dry by morning. And these materials that I've listed as safe for bees are safe when they are dry. And a final consideration is that we're learning that fungicides mixed with insecticides can actually increase the toxicity of the insecticide to bees. So things like those 3-in-1 and 4-in-1 rose products that contain both a fungicide and an insecticide are really something to have some concerns about. And then finally, I think you've already been notified about this, but I'll mention that we do classes at the garden for the public to help bring in revenue and to provide education about gardening and bees. And our next class coming up is in the beginning of November, and it's going to focus on pruning. And so finally, I just want to end by making sure you're aware of the various resources that the Bee Haven does provide. We have the usual social media in the form of Facebook and Instagram. We post videos to YouTube, and I also do a blog about gardening for bees. So that is my presentation, and see if we have, oh, Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to just read the chat to yourself, or do you want me to?
Yeah, let me go ahead
Okay.
and stop sharing, and then my chat, the chat here. Okay.
It's it's at the bottom.
Okay. Is there a reason why flowers such as tomatoes evolve so that pollinating needs buzz pollination? You know, in general, when we see plants or any resource in the environment that has evolved so that not all animals can utilize it, it's a way of distributing resources so that more different animals have access to it. So another example of this is monkey flowers. There was a study done that showed that monkey flowers that occur now that are native to California have a range of flower colors or a gradation of flower colors within the same species. And there was a study done finding that bees tend to pollinate ones that are on one end of the color spectrum, and hummingbirds go to the other end of the color spectrum. So you have one plant that has evolved to provide resources for more than one animal. So I think that's why things like this evolve. Next question, leafcutter bees, do the holes they make cause damage to the plants? Absolutely not. I've never seen that. I've seen plants completely defoliated by leafcutter bees that come back just fine the following year. Not something I would worry about. Okay, do leafcutters place the female eggs in back and male eggs in the front? Yes, so all bees have the ability to control the sex of their offspring. If male bees only have one set of chromosomes, female bees have two. So the female makes a decision as she lays an egg whether or not she's going to fertilize it. And they do that in response to varying resources in the environment. And so what they do when they're building building nests or laying eggs in those cavities, they lay the females in the back of the cavity and the males in the front. And they can tell how far in they've walked. And that's how they make that decision. And they do that for two reasons. By having males in the front, it ensures that males emerge first and are ready when females come out for mating. And it also protects the more valuable females. And what this means for us in practical purposes is that if you put out buy one of those bee blocks or put out nests for those cavity nesting bees, they need to be at least 4.5 inches deep, or else you'll just get male bees. So is it okay to leave the leaf cutter straws in place after the eggs are laid? You can leave them out. I think it's preferable if you have an unheated garage or shed or some kind of slightly sheltered place. I like to collect them for the winter. Don't obviously put them someplace heated because they would emerge too soon. But I put them in a bucket that I put a lid on and leave it sitting next to the shed. And it just helps a little bit to keep any moisture out. We've had squirrels eat them. So it's just a little bit, not necessary, but it's nice if you can do it. So do you have a list of flowers that carry protein sources, nectar for carbohydrate sources? Boy, do I wish I did. That's really, really important. I mean, we have certainly the plant list for the bee garden lists whether or not the plant is a pollen resource, a nectar resource, or both. But in terms of further understanding, like, is this plant a really high protein pollen? Is this plant a carbohydrate, a nectar that's got these really great secondary plant compounds? That's information that is still to be determined through research. We really don't have that at this point. Do you know if there's a type of mulch that is better for bees overall? So there really isn't any mulch that's better for bees. You want to leave bare soil. But in general, I would try to avoid any of the mulches that have artificial coloring in them, just because if that material should leach onto the ground, we don't really know what the effect of it is on bees. So mulch is certainly a positive for most plants. So you don't need there isn't really we can't say, for example, if you leave 25 square feet of bare soil, you'll get X number of bees as a result. But it certainly doesn't have to be a large area. I mean, and we'll see, even just if you've got mature shrubs in your garden where the leaves of the shrubs are providing cover for the soil, just leaving mulch away from the area between those plants can be enough. Or just, maybe the length of a garage, a foot deep. It doesn't have to be a large area, but unfortunately, we don't really have an exact figure that would correspond to a certain bee density. Yeah, Chinese tallow tree. I really don't know specifically what bee would go to that, unfortunately. So what did NASA want to know? I'm not sure what you're asking there.
Okay. So at the end of that's the end of the questions, huh?
I don't have anything else in the chat unless
Okay.
anyone has other
All right.
questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was fascinating and really helpful. And I'm sure for all of us, it gives us something to think about to, increase the number of opportunities for bees in our gardens.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And again, if you have not had the opportunity to visit the Bee Haven, absolutely do so either at one of their, presentations or the sessions, or I think just general people can drop by still, used to be able
The
to.
garden is open every day from dawn till dusk. I will point out that my funding ends in April, so I don't know what will happen after that. So
Okay, well, so if you can afford to go to one of those presentations where there's a small fee, it certainly would be helpful too. But yeah, it's a great place to visit. So, all right, thank you, Dr. Casey. That was fascinating, and
great.
you had a pretty good group of people, and I think this is a pretty knowledgeable group of gardeners. So I'm sure they're going to take this information out and
Yeah, that's great.
talk to their friends, and yeah.
Yeah.
Really good. All right, so next week, or not next week, but next session is October 12th, and it's going to be Maureen Clark, not Callahan. That was my screw up. Some don't ask me why or how. I got the wrong name out there, but you may remember Maureen actually did the sessions on irrigation a couple of months ago. So this time she's going to on drip systems. So this time she's going to talk about how to use those drip systems in the most efficient way. So everything about irrigation and watering plants on October 12th, 3 o'clock. All right. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye.